Hi everyone. How are you guys doing? Just give me 1 minute, we'll start. So we are doing right now Feb March 2022. This is the India paper. That is somebody sent it to me. So I don't have the official link to this one, but I got it. It's not on the CIE website, so I was surprised how it was available. But nonetheless, let's solve it. Let's start with this. So uh, the data response is from macro, and I have a feeling that the data response will be from macro for us. Just 1 minute, guys. Guys, look at the data here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go to the text, and then we come back to the data. The voice was not lagging actually. I had to mute it for 1 minute, but can you hear me properly? Okay, sorry. So Turkey central bank expected to cut interest rates for 10th time in a row. So Turkey is basically trying to cut the interest rates. Turkey's central bank is expected to uh, approve for further reduction in interest rates. So they're trying to make the interest rate go down. Most economists predict that the interest rate will fall. So interest rate will fall is what they're planning. R for interest rate for us, right? And they're saying that, or whether the bank may soon need to raise them to reduce inflation. So we'll talk about how when the interest rates go up, it can make the inflation to go down. Turkey's central bank has cut the interest rate from 24%. It is now expected that the rate will be 8%. So when the interest rate goes down, basically we know this, AD will go up. So the economy will find some economic growth to happen. However, they also said something strange here, which I want to point out. They said this that, however, some wonder whether interest rate will continue to fall, or whether the bank may start to need to raise them to reduce inflation. When the interest rate go up, apparently inflation will go down. Okay, we'll talk about this more when we are doing the data response. Annual consumer price inflation was 8.6 in 2019, and now is 11.4%, reducing the international competitiveness of Turkey's goods and services. Of course, when the price level goes up, your competitiveness will go down. This means if the rate of interest was cut to 8%, the real interest will be negative. So we talk about why is the real interest rate negative, and what is real interest rate, also something in the questions. Okay. The real interest rate in Turkey calculated by subtracting the annual. So real basically is interest rate. They've given us the formula. So let me just quickly write this down. It's equal to your nominal interest rate minus inflation rate. Okay. It's among the lowest in the world. It is minus 3.4% compared to minus 0.6% in the euro, and minus 3.3% in South Africa. This negative rate in Turkey discourages foreign investors from lending to the Turkish government, potentially affecting the value of the Turkey's currency, the lira. So they're saying that when you have this, people will not be investing in your country because you don't have a good interest rate. And as a result of that, you might see the lira, the currency, to fall. The currency fell to a record level of 7.3% per US dollar, mainly due to concerns over the level of interest rate. So, guys, there is a strong sort of feeling your exchange rate, your data response will be also from a similar topic, either exchange rate, inflation. We've been seeing that, and I'm trying to sort of make sure that you guys do this in the practice as well. Analysts differ over whether the expected interest rate cut will be the central bank's last, or whether it will continue to reduce the borrowing costs. Something that it will generate inflation as the economy recovers from the impact of COVID-19. However, others are suggesting that the bank may continue to cut the interest rate because the Turkish government appears determined to do everything it can to speed up economic recovery. So let's do the data response and then we'll come back to this text. With reference to figure 1.1, describe how Turkey's current account balance has changed between August 19 to April 2020. So if you look at this data, guys, August 2019, it was a surplus, right? So this is your current account balance. It was a surplus of 3304, and in April, it's a deficit of minus 5,062, and this is basically given in $1 million. So from a surplus, it's gone to a deficit. If you look at the marks, this is for 2 marks, so you need to mention 2 things. So you can first talk about from a surplus, it's gone to a deficit, and you can talk about how for the first 3 months, August, September, October, it was a surplus, or rather even like November, for 4 months, it was a surplus, and then became a deficit. Make sense? So from a surplus, it became a deficit, and it was a deficit for the next 5 months. So you can talk about this in this answer. Any questions, guys, before we move on? Piyush or Isa, anyone, Saman, does that make sense? So 2 marks, 2 points. One was from a surplus, it went to a deficit. Second was that for the first 4 months, it was a surplus, and then for the next 5 months, it's a deficit. Okay. The next thing is, how could the data in figure 1.2 be used to explain the changes in the terms of trade between August 2019 and April 2020 as shown in figure 1.3? So how can the data in figure 1.2 be used to explain the changes in the terms of trade between August 2019 to, so they're asking us to compare this with this figure. Okay, first one is your inflation rate, and the next one is your terms of trade. So look at the question again. They're saying, how could the data be used to explain the changes in the terms of trade? So what is terms of trade? Let's talk about terms of trade. Terms, write it better. Terms of trade is simply PX over PM, export price to PM into 100. Pauses, can we write about the deficit improved at first and then worsened? Deficit improved and then worsened. Yeah, you can talk about this there, give 5 ways with data, but first you need to give the big picture first, and then you need to give the second picture. So it says figure 1.2 and 1.3. So yeah, this is figure 1.1, this is figure 1.2, and this is 1.3. Amar, does that make sense? Okay. Now, guys, look at what is happening here. That terms of trade is showing us a trend of improvement. So my terms of trade is improving. Isn't that true, guys? Do you agree with that? Our terms of trade is improving, which means PX is rising faster than PM. And that makes sense because if you look at your inflation, the inflation level is continuously, if you look at this, this is rate of inflation and not price level. Your rate of inflation is positive. You guys get that? Which would mean that the question is asking, how could the data be used to explain? Because if your rate of inflation is positive, then one could argue this, that the price level is going up, which would mean exports will become expensive, imports will become cheaper, and that would mean the terms of trade will go up. And since there is inflation happening, Humayun, inflation increasing at decreasing rate, it's the what you need to look at, it's positive inflation. It's positive inflation, which means the prices are still going up. And whatever rate the prices are going up, which means terms of trade, which is PX, which is price level is, which is PX or PM. PX is going up, PM is going out, going down, and that's why. So this is what it is. This is not accumulated. This is annual rate, inflation rate each month. Piyush, it's, does that make sense? Do we agree with this, guys? Okay. How the terms of trade is improving because the prices are going up, and when you say terms of trade improving, it's basically export prices are rising faster than import prices, or import prices might be rising, import prices might be going down. The numerator is more than the denominator, and that's why you will see this to happen. Okay, C part. Consumer price inflation was 8.6% per annum in October 2019 and is now 11.4%, reducing the international competitiveness of Turkey's goods and services. Explain using the concept of price elastic demand how the increase in inflation has caused the change in Turkey's current account of the balance of payment between October 2019 and April 2020. So let's go back to October 2019 and April 2020. So October 2019, you had a surplus, right? Then your trend is like going down. You had a larger deficit. This is October 2019 to April 2020, right? And then you saw that the current account became a lower deficit and then became a bigger deficit. So from a surplus, it became a deficit, and then the deficit went down, and then the deficit went up again. And look at what is happening. Now look at, compare this, because they're saying, using the concept of price elastic demand, how the increase in inflation has caused the change in Turkey's current account of the balance of payment between this period, right? And they say consumer price inflation was 8.6%, and is now 11.4%, reducing international competitiveness. So what is happening, guys, is this, that your current account is when you look at inflation. Now let's look at current account now during this period. So look at October, your current account balance. I'm sorry, now let's look at inflation. Your inflation basically was 8.5%, it rose, and then it fell. Do you guys get this idea? That inflation, when inflation was rising, and then inflation, you saw this had to happen. But interestingly, look at this trend. So why, if somebody can explain PD elastic to cause a deficit, is Humayun saying. But Humayun, one more thing I want to talk about very quickly is understand what the trend is saying, because you are looking at first the current account. Let me just write this here so that it becomes easier for us to compare. October 2019, we saw a surplus, right? And then from surplus, it became surplus went down. So, and then it became a deficit, right? This was also the time when the exchange rate is going up, but it kept on going up, but then the deficit starts to fall. So one could argue this, the reason why, despite the price level to go up, the current account deficit is shrinking could be for the fact that in the short run, the goods are inelastic, which means when the price of exports go up, the quantity of exports is not falling by that much. And that is why one could argue this, your current account deficit is not increasing despite the rise in price level. Do you guys get that? There seems to be a lag which is happening, some kind of a delay, because then the inflation rate went down, but your deficit started to grow. So because the goods are inelastic, there could be a reason why you might see a delay to happen. Remember, we talked about our J-curve effect. We said that if you look at the time period, initially things may get worse. So this could be like an inverse J-curve, that when you look at time period, I can't talk about J-curve here because I just realized that we need to look at exchange rate also. But here I'm looking at more like price level, that probably the goods are inelastic, and that's why it may take some time for things to improve. So when the examiner is asking us, is explain the concept using the concept price elastic demand, how the increase in inflation has caused the change in Turkey's current account balance of payment between October 2019 and April, shown in figure 1.1. So we can talk about this, that whenever price level goes up, the current account should be in a deficit. However, having said that, when the prices are rising, initially it did show the deficit to rise, but then when the inflation level is rising, which means prices are rising at a faster rate, the current account is still not becoming a bigger deficit because it takes some time before the reaction happens. But later on, as inflation persists, you will see the current account to become a larger deficit. So explaining that goods must be inelastic in the short run. And basically a delay is happening. Do you guys get this? Do we get the answer for this? Are we good to move on? How do you show that? Because the question isn't really asking about, it's looking at PED. Time factor has to be mentioned here, yes, Piyush, because in the short run versus long run, elasticity varies, and that's why the deficit is reacting a little slowly to that. Okay, now let's look at D part. Explain how a negative real rate of interest in Turkey will affect the function of money, standard of deferred payment. So what is standard of deferred payment? Standard of deferred payment basically is a function which says this, that I can basically pay later, or I can borrow today and pay or return money later. Okay, in other words, standard of deferred payment is basically the principle of borrowing and lending. So if you have a negative real rate, which means that, let's say I give you a loan at 5%, but inflation is, for example, 10%, I will effectively give minus 5%. So if your negative real rate would mean lenders will not be lending as the ultimate return they gain will be negative, will be less. So lenders will lose out, borrowers will gain, because the rate of inflation is higher than the one that is out there. Okay, make sense? The borrowers are, because the inflation rate is high, Humayun, inflation इन्फ्लेशन थी 10%, राइट? अगर आज मैंने तुमसे 100 लिए हैं, राइट, कल अगर इन्फ्लेशन 10% है, सो कल द वैल्यू शुड बी लाइक 110, right? But because you will only be paying me 105 because you are getting it 5%. Got it? Make sense? Are we good? So in real terms, lenders listing. So let's look at store of value. Store of value is basically when you are borrowing money, right? Store of value is when you're saving. From a saver perspective, guys, agar aapne, if you save 100 today, okay, hoping that next after 1 year you get 105, but the purchasing power of 105 is much less, you should expect to get 110. If you want to buy something which was for 100 today, you want to get 110, but because the interest rate is only 5%, you get 105. So people will be discouraged to save. Why? Because they will be like, it's no point to save because the interest rates are negative, or real interest rates are negative. The inflation is much higher than what it should be. So again, this will also discourage borrowers, and not only borrowers, it will also discourage savers, because the inflation is rising faster than the rate of interest. So first you need to explain what a store of value is. So we talk about what a store of value is, and that's what we need to. Okay, got it? Any questions, guys? Okay, moving on. Let me clean this up. Discuss discuss with the help of an aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram whether further cuts in Turkey's interest rates are likely to generate inflation or speed up recovery. So this is a very good question. They're asking us with the ADAS diagram, when you are cutting interest rates, when you cut interest rates, R for interest rates, what happens, guys? Consumption goes up, investment goes up. Why? Because the cost of borrowing is going down, incentive to save is going down. As a result of that, AD will go up. And when AD goes up, you will see the GDP to go up. Now, the way you need to explain this diagram is basically whether it's going to generate inflation or not depends on your shape of the aggregate supply curve. If my shape of the aggregate supply curve is like this, let's say this is my long run aggregate supply curve, or you can only also write aggregate supply curve, and this is your price level, right? This is your real GDP. If the AD curve shifts to the right from 80 to 81, guys, there is a rise in GDP, but no increase in price level. Why is that so? Why? Because one could argue that this is the case where the economy, let me write this, economy has the spare capacity to meet the increased demand. Okay, so when the economy has the spare capacity to meet the increased demand, you will see no rise in inflation. Make sense? But if your AD was here, and AD goes from 82 to 83, you will see this will generate inflation. Are you all with me? Does that make sense? Will this recording be uploaded on YouTube? Because tomorrow is S1 exam. Yes, yes, yes. Go ahead. Do your S1 exam, guys. Don't worry about it. This will be recorded. This is recorded. It will be uploaded. I did upload the one that we did yesterday, so don't worry about that. So you can just write aggregate supply curve. Honestly speaking, Amen, it doesn't really matter. I wrote aggregate supply for that very reason. You can talk about aggregate supply curve. But the idea goes this: here you need to talk about, it's a 6 marks question. The examiner wants you to show the diagram. Talk about the rise in AD would result in GDP to go up, and if the economy doesn't have the spare capacity, it will cause inflation to go up. So depending on whether the economy has spare capacity or not, this policy of reducing interest rate will result in definitely the AD to go up. Now, the question is asking us generate inflation or speed up recovery, and speed up recovery means GDP going up. Okay, so the evaluation is it all depends on whether the economy has spare capacity or not. Eamon, I did answer your question. Also, can you show that with SRAS? The idea is this, Myra, that we are showing this with the aggregate supply curve, and you can call it SRAS or aggregate LRAS. The idea goes this, that you need to show the fact that the shape of the aggregate supply curve matter, whether it will generate inflation or not, or whether it will speed up recovery or not. Make sense? You can also talk about this. Amar is right to point out, when the interest rates are going down, your hot money flows out, right? And that will result in your exchange rate to fall. Exports become cheaper, imports become expensive, and therefore X minus M will go up, causing again GDP to go up. But the shape of the aggregate supply curve will matter here. Are we good? We can't show a shift in the supply curve. This isn't a shift case, guys. It's a shift of the AD curve. Got it? Make sense? Okay, I want to move on now. Let's quickly do our essay questions. So I'm going to go backwards with number 4 first. An economy is facing the shutdown of its steel making industry as a result of cheap imports. What is meant by protectionism? That's the first question. What is meant by protectionism? And describe 2 ways in which this steel industry can be protected. So you can talk about that protectionism means when we are protecting international trade by increasing price or reducing quantity, therefore promoting domestic production. Okay, 2 ways could be tariffs and quotas. You can draw the diagram for tariffs and quota. Describe the same. Tariff is a tax, so I can make a diagram like this one. I can make demand and supply. I can say if this is currently the world price, and let's say Q2 minus Q1 is being imported, you can put a tariff. This is PW, this is PW plus T, and this could be Q3 minus Q1. So A tariff can make the world price to go up. It's a tax which will result in the price to go up, and therefore world price to go up, and therefore the level of imports to fall. So tariff is a tax, right? Is it necessary to draw a diagram here as each method is associated? I would draw a diagram here because when you write about tariffs and you don't have a way to show this, then Humayun, you may not go get your marks because honestly speaking, there is then the definition and the method to write, but that won't be good enough. Okay. Okay, then we can talk about quota. When you look at quota, guys, a quota is basically a reduction in the quantity of imports by putting a physical limit. So my quota diagram is slightly different. If this is your Q2 minus Q1 is the level of imports, this is your world supply, right? My quota diagram says this, that the supply curve SD is the domestic supply plus SD plus quota is allowed. So ultimately, you're only allowing the yellow supply curve of which price becomes PW dash, and therefore the quota amount will be Q3 minus Q4. So when you give a quota, it's a physical limit, right? It's a physical limit. It will result in basically quantity to fall and therefore the price to go up in this case. You should need to mention elasticity of demand here. Agar evaluation hota, to I would have said yes, why not mention that, but not in this case. Got it? So I'll explain those two methods. I'll explain what protectionism is. So this is an easy question. B part says discuss the advantages and disadvantages of protecting industries such as steel and consider whether the protection will be overall benefit to the economy. So what are the pros and cons of protection? So we can talk about advantages of protecting trade could be your infant industry argument, your job protection or sunset industry. It could be on the grounds of balance of payment, and it could also be basically dumping, when somebody is dumping. The cons, so these are the pros. The cons of this is simply, guys, number one is that it doesn't allow free trade. It makes the good to be, like expensive. Remember, it doesn't allow free trade, so makes the good expensive, lower choice, less variety, right? Also, if you look at counter arguments for infant industry, what if we are basically choosing wrong industries to protect, which are not really winners to begin with? Also, you can talk about, retaliation can happen from other countries. And so on. The conclusion that I would like to make here, guys, is this, that dumping is one important reason where when you are dumping, we are dumping because either we have overproduced a good or we are trying to destroy local competition. Both of these are illegal to begin with, and therefore trade protection is justified on that ground. Make sense? We can talk about that. Now, economy is facing the shutdown, obviously as a result of cheap imports. Now, if it's a Wahab is saying, no, Mayu is saying steel being strategically important. So steel being strategically important isn't really mentioned here, but if it is strategically important and the country is trying to protect it on the grounds of that, that's also true. But normally it's not an economic reason. If it is important for the fact that it provides your country with some advantage in terms of lower cost, even if it's strategically important and if it's allowed, I mean, it's available cheaply in other countries, you rather want to buy that. Okay, so conclusion could be on the grounds of dumping, one could argue this, the trade is justified to be protected, otherwise one would argue not to do so. Okay, let's look at 3A. Use examples to explain why the supply of some product is price elastic and the supply of other product is price inelastic. So guys, explain PES, which is percentage change in quantity supplied over percentage change in price. Talk about, it is a responsiveness of quantity supplied to a change in price. Then we talk about elastic means that PES is greater than 1, which means very responsive to a change in price. Inelastic means PES is less than 1, which means not so responsive to a change in price. And what does PES depends upon? It depends upon many things. It depends upon whether the goods are your ability to store, which means are the goods perishable or non-perishable. Number 2 is basically your spare capacity. The higher the spare capacity, the more elastic will be the supply. The third one is basically your, sorry, is there a delay happening for everyone? Somebody just mentioned there is a delay happening. It's fine. Okay, so I'm going to, Fawad, I think there's something on your end. Okay, guys, ability to store, spare capacity. Third one was time period. There was one more. Can somebody tell me which was the fourth one? Anyone? Nature of the product. What do you mean by that, nature of the product? Nature of the product. So the exactly, guys. So some of you are saying the right thing. So PES factors, the availability of stock is basically your ability to store. So I think you guys are using different words for the same things. So PES, we said this, that spare capacity, mobility of factors of production is the last one, which I was looking for. Mobility of factors of production. If it's easy to move factors of production from one use to another, exactly, Hasib, that will make the supply to become more elastic. Perishable versus non-perishable is your ability to store. Okay, and then time period, the longer the time period, the more elastic will be the supply. Okay, discuss the ways in which fiscal policy can be used to increase aggregate supply of the products in the economy and consider whether this approach is likely to be effective. So it's interesting to see a micro question in the first part and macro question in the second part, which is something. Ability to store and spare capacity are not the same thing. Ability to store means perishable versus non-perishable. Spare capacity means, let's say if I can make 100 items, but I'm only making 50 items, which means that I still have the spare capacity to basically increase the supply. Make sense? Okay, discuss the ways in which fiscal policy can be used to increase the aggregate supply. So guys, when you look at fiscal policy, we had a really good discussion last time. Fiscal policy is your changing G or changing T, right? And when you look at fiscal policy, it will change AD. Why? Because let's say if you're looking at the question saying, can be used to increase supply of products in an economy. So basically, it's a demand side policy. When we look at it, it's a demand side policy. However, if the government spending is targeted towards research and development or infrastructure, or for example, production in terms of subsidies, like so production subsidies, one may argue that the effect of all this could be increasing aggregate supply in the long run. And therefore, one may argue this, that fiscal policy could be when the government is basically spending on all these things, because they're saying discuss the ways in which fiscal policy can be used to increase the aggregate supply of the economy and consider whether this approach is likely to be effective. Now, when you're doing so, you are basically trying to make sure that as the government is intervening in the market to make the aggregate supply curve shift outward. Right? This is when the government is spending its own money. And also, yeah, very good. So there could be more money spent on education and training and so on, right? So the government is taking initiatives to make the aggregate supply go to the right. Now, typically, we put this in a supply side policy, right? A very good example Hasib is giving. He's saying, like even like taxes, you could say this, that by the way, this is G going up. When G goes up, right, or T goes down. Because when the T goes down, that could also increase supply. Hasib is absolutely right, because there will be more incentive to invest. So your incentive to invest in everything will go up. So what happens, guys, as a result of this, you will see the AS curve to shift to the right, but only in the long run, right? So there is a couple of points that we need to mention, that this policy of using government expenditure and so on can work in the long run, right? And it's expensive and has an opportunity cost. So you can talk about these points, because if you are looking at very good money and can lead to a budget deficit, because the government is spending money, right? So discuss the ways in which fiscal policy can be used to increase aggregate supply of products in an economy, and consider whether this approach is likely to be effective. And the answer is that yes, it will be likely to be effective, but only in the long run. However, it's expensive, there is an opportunity cost, and the budget deficit will happen, right? But also there is a point that you can raise, this, that in the short run, and somebody was mentioning this, the point, in the short run, it can also lead to inflation, because fiscal policy of expansionary nature makes the AD go up, causing the price level to go up. You are using a fiscal policy primarily as a supply side policy. Yeah, the idea goes is that can we suggest other policy in the evaluation? You can talk about other policies. Can be, for example, monetary policy, which can make the interest rate go down, make the borrowing to become cheaper, and provide incentive for firms to invest. That could be given. But here, I would suggest more of an evaluation of the cons of this policy in terms of inflation, budget deficit, and all that. Uh, Hasib, what other policy will you use, if I could ask you? Supply side, but actually, I'm using all of these to make the aggregate supply curve go to the right. I'm using all of this in terms of channeling government's expenditure. So in a way, it is supply side policies. Make sense? But there is a very important point we can mention here. So some supply side policies are policies that allow the market to operate freely, or encourage more, like privatization. So those policies are such where the government is really spending, but the government is trying to fix the economy by letting it to operate more freely. So you can conclude in your answer that supply side policies that does not allow government expenditure to go up can be one way of dealing with this problem. Make sense? So you can talk about that. Are we good? But that's a very good point, Hasib. So you can talk about those policies. Okay. Now let's look at question number 2. Guys, 2 is really easy. Explain with the help of PPC how a decision to reallocate resources in the economy to produce more capital goods and fewer consumption goods. So we've done this in our notes also. Capital is K, consumer is C. You are reallocating resources right from, let's say, more consumer to capital means lower living standard today, but that will lead to economic growth in the future. So more jam today versus more jam tomorrow. So there will be a higher living standard in the future. Right? So we can talk about the idea. So the first paragraph will be basically what is the PPC, what does it show, and what do we mean by points on the curve versus under the curve. Then we talk about what do we mean by reallocation of resources from consumer to capital, and therefore how does it lead to a lower living standard today but higher living standard tomorrow in terms of economic growth to happen. Therefore the shift of the PPC will happen. So in the short run, consumers might get affected negatively. In the long run, they might not be affected negatively. They will be better off. I would mention the assumptions. There's no harm in mentioning the from where to get your notes. The notes are available at the website. On the website, so please go ahead and download the notes if you haven't done so. Okay, discuss whether the transition from a planned economy to a market economy will always benefit consumers. I'm not a big fan of this kind of a question, but transition, what is transition? Transition means when we're going from a planned to a free market economy. Okay, this transition basically means, guys, that the economy will now be relying more on market forces of demand supply. There will be less government intervention. There will be more international trade, free trade, and international trade. Also, there will be more resource allocation through the private sector than the public sector. But because of this transition, there will be some short-run issues of transition. We talked about this in our notes. let me reiterate those ideas. Remember, we talked about, if I quickly sort of go back to our discussion that we did in transition classes, we talked about, guys, when the government is relying on, like closing down firms and opening more private firms, we saw that there will be a short run sort of industrial bottlenecks. So if you go to the notes, there is a discussion that we did where we talk about, Piyush, no, this is a different discussion altogether. If you go to the notes, you will see there's a problems of transition. So first you talk about features of transition, like new firms will open up, other firms will close down. There is more international trade, there's deregulation and so on. But there will be unemployment that will happen. There will also be inflation that will take place in the short run because supply issues are there. Retraining of workers will be required, and there will be, because of absence of welfare system, income distribution will be unfair. Exactly. So talk about that as a problem that can happen. However, in the long run, as we look at the case of China and Russia, there will be more economic growth that will happen because efficiency will go up and so on. Got it, guys. So please take from the notes. No, Myra, we don't need to mention that discussion. This is not a question about pros and cons of free market versus command economy. This is a question about transition. So you need to talk about features of transition, which is more private sector utilization, more price mechanism, deregulation, opening up of the economy in terms of international trade, reduction of bureaucracy, and closing down of inefficient firms and so on. From where you need to get it, from the website econwithali.com. The notes are at econwithali.com. If you go there, there is notes also available. Got it? Guys, I'm done. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, our class will happen on the Alt Academy platform. And the Alt Academy has all the videos for, has all the videos available for AS economics. Okay, so if you want to revise, there it has all the content available. No problem at all, guys. I'm helping everyone, anyone who's taking economics, my students or not my students. It doesn't really matter to me. All I want you guys to get good grades, and for me to get a lot of prayers. So if you get a good exam done, if you're happy with the performance, and if you feel I have any role to play, do write to me. Let me know, and that would be great. Okay. YouTube channel name is Ali Anwarzada. If you search Ali Anwarzada, you'll get the YouTube channel. Mass. Search on Ali Anwarzada on YouTube and you'll find out the videos. I will upload this as well. Okay, so let me stop recording so that we could upload this later on. Okay, have a good one, guys. Take care. Bye bye.